The Star Wars universe has long stood as a mythic stage of stories of rebellion, resistance, and redemption. But behind these battles and iconic characters lies a deeper question: who gets to be part of these stories and on what terms? While the franchise draws heavily from East Asian aesthetics through costume, philosophy, and martial arts, it has often historically failed to centre actual East Asians in meaningful roles. This video explores how East Asians are marginalised in Star Wars, using the work of theorists such as Stuart Hall and Edward Said to examine how identity is constructed, represented, and resisted within this cultural juggernaut. The recent inclusion of more Asian characters as seen in the Acolyte signals a shift, but one that remains fraught, partial, and contested. Stuart Hall believed that identity isn't something we are simply born with, but something shaped by history and culture. In his essay, Cultural Identity and Diaspora in 1990, Hall outlines two approaches to cultural identity. The first is an essentialist view, which sees identity as a one true self rooted in common ancestry and collective experience. This idea is often used to foster unity among colonised or displaced peoples, those living in diaspora due to migration, slavery, or exile. It assumes individuals from the same background naturally share the same culture or values. However, Hall challenges this essentialism. He proposes that identity is fluid and evolving, shaped by the different ways we are positioned by and position ourselves within the narrative of the past. In this view, identity is not fixed at birth, but is formed over time, through personal experience, cultural memory, and the ways we are represented in society. Hall suggests identity is not something we own, but is something we are continuously forming, negotiating, and reinterpreting. Representation plays a central role in Hall's theory of identity. He argues that identity is not solely personal or internal, but is thoroughly shaped by how individuals are represented in language, media, and culture. These representations are never neutral. They are embedded within systems of ideology and power that often reinforce dominant social norms and hierarchies. Hall's encoding-decoding model shows that media producers encode messages with intended meanings, but audiences decode them in different ways: dominant, negotiated, or oppositional. This model emphasises that audiences actively construct meaning, making media a key site of identity formation. Yet Hall also acknowledged that many people internalise media representations unconsciously. Dominant images and narratives about beauty, race, gender, or success become so familiar that they feel natural, meaning that over time, repeated exposures to these images shapes how people perceive themselves and others. In this view, media doesn't just reflect reality, it constructs it, embedding and reproducing cultural ideologies.
We made the story, we shaped it, we blew it up, we decided when it was over. With the right ideas, planted in the right markets, in the right sequence, we can now weaponize this galactic opinion.
Hall emphasised that identity is multiple and layered, not singular or unified. People simultaneously belong to various social categories: race, gender, class, sexuality, nationality, and these overlapping identities shape their lived experience. Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality expands on this idea, showing how systems of oppression are interlinked and how individuals are shaped by the simultaneous impact of racism, classism, sexism, and more. For those living in diasporic or post-colonial backgrounds, identity is often hybrid, blending influences from multiple cultures. This implies, for example, that a person of colour raised in a Western society may adopt the language, customs, and values of their surroundings, yet still be denied full belonging. At the same time, they may feel disconnected from their ancestral heritage.
I can pack my entire identity in an hour, because where there's roots, there's power, but I'm all topsoil. My blood runs like water and oil refusing to stick.
Hall's concept of identity as a process of becoming captures this complexity. Identity is shaped by movement, contradiction, and cultural negotiation, not by static belonging. A key insight from Hall is that identity is constructed through difference. We define ourselves by what we are not. This relies on binary oppositions like black-white, male-female, east-west. These binaries can provide meaning, but also reinforce hierarchies and exclusions. In colonial and media discourse, the West frequently defines itself by portraying the non-West world as other, for example, exotic, dangerous, or inferior. This process of othering was used to justify domination and maintain Western cultural superiority. Hall argues that these oppositions are not natural truths but cultural constructions rooted in history and ideology. However, he also saw potential for resistance. Marginalised groups can challenge imposed identities and create counter-narratives, stories and representations that disrupt stereotypes and reclaim agency. Identity is thus always open for transformation, especially through cultural expression, activism, and storytelling. Although Hall did not directly claim that people consume media to find identity, his work strongly implies that media is a key site of identity exploration. According to uses and gratifications theory, people seek out media to fulfill specific needs, including the need for identity. Scholars like Henry Jenkins and David Goblet expand on this by arguing that media use is participatory. Audiences don't just consume media, they interact with it, remix it, and try on different identities. Through fandom, role models, and shared narratives, media becomes a space where identity is continuously explored, affirmed, or resisted. When Star Wars first introduced Luke Skywalker, he quickly became a symbol of heroism and hope. Many fans identified with him, seeing in his character a reflection of their own values and ideals. As a result, when Disney reimagined Luke in The Last Jedi as a more disillusioned and morally conflicted character, this shift challenged that symbolic connection. It could be argued that to some, it felt like a betrayal of the heroic image they had long internalized, leading to backlash rooted in a sense of personal and symbolic loss. However, some may argue that this reinterpretation represents a meaningful evolution, one that deepened Luke's character by adding realism and emotional complexity, challenging ageist stereotypes rather than diminishing his legacy. From this perspective, resistance to change may stem less from issues about storytelling itself, and more from attachment of a familiar version of that character shaped by nostalgia and long-held expectations. On the other hand, it is important to recognise that fan responses are multifaceted. Whilst discomfort with shifting cultural norms may underlie some of the backlash, criticism can also stem from genuine disagreements about the storytelling, tone, or creative direction. Since Disney acquired Star Wars, the franchise has diversified its stories and characters. Shows like Obi-Wan Kenobi and The Book of Boba Fett introduced new perspectives, but largely centered on familiar faces, offering a sense of nostalgic continuity. These series received mixed reviews, but rarely provoked the same level of hostility seen with The Acolyte. The Acolyte has experienced a disproportionate level of criticism, which some suggest may be partially due to its diverse cast, female protagonist, and departure from the traditional Skywalker saga. Similar patterns of heightened aggression have been observed with characters such as Rose Tico, played by Kelly Marie Tran, and Reva Savanda, played by Moses Ingram, who were targeted by hate campaigns laced with racism and misogyny. Some fans claim that their criticism is about writing or pacing, yet the reoccurring pattern of disproportionate backlash when minorities take leading roles indicates the underlying resistance to shift in representation, especially when those shifts challenge dominant group identities. As Hall argued, identity is shaped by the stories and systems of representation, so when those systems shift, it can unsettle audiences who no longer see themselves reflected in the same way they once did. The Cambridge Dictionary defines Orientalism as Western ideas about the Middle East, East and Southeast Asia, especially ideas that are too simple or not accurate about these societies being mysterious, never changing, or not able to develop in a modern way without Western help. Meaningful representation in media requires more than simply casting diverse actors. It depends on giving those characters emotional depth, political agency, and narrative significance. Characters like Chimera generate intrigue through stylized performance and sensuality, but this allure risks reinforcing Orientalist spectacle if not supported by deeper storytelling. Challenging Orientalist tropes involves placing Asian characters in central, politically engaged roles, not just spiritual mentors or mysterious outsiders. It also requires an intersectional approach that addresses how race, gender, and sexuality shape representation. Without this, representation risks remaining surface level, present but powerless, visible but narratively sidelined. This tension between aesthetic visibility and political exclusion echoes Edward Said's critique of how the East has historically been represented in Western discourse. In Orientalism, 1978, Said argued that Western portrayals of Asia, the Middle East and North Africa often romanticize, distort or simplify these cultures, reducing them to stereotypes: exotic, irrational, stagnant, or threatening. The Star Wars universe is steeped in Orientalist imagery. The Jedi Order evokes Zen monks or samurai warriors. Lightsaber duels resemble katana combat. Desert planets recall the landscapes of the Middle East. Yet these cultural borrowings are filtered through a Western lens and rarely include actual Asian characters in major roles. The result is what Said warned against, a fantasy of the East that aestheticizes its imagery while erasing the people it references. This reflects what some scholars term Asiatic performance without Asian presence, the appropriation of cultural signifiers without the inclusion of the people and traditions they reference. Popularized by William Peterson in 1966, the model minority myth describes Asian Americans as a group that achieves success through intelligence, hard work, and emotional restraint, despite facing systemic racism. While this narrative may seem complementary, it is deeply problematic. It flattens Asian identity into a narrow success story, obscuring the realities of poverty, violence, and marginalization experienced by many. Moreover, the myth can subtly reinforce harmful racial hierarchies by positioning Asian success as a contrast to other marginalized groups, particularly black communities. It suggests that overcoming racism is possible through conformity, assimilation, and compliance, thus fostering division and rivalry between minority groups rather than solidarity. This narrative also plays into gendered stereotypes that dehumanize and constrain Asian identity. Asian men, for example, have long been desexualized, portrayed as passive, socially awkward, or asexual. These portrayals originate from Western colonialism, exclusionary immigration laws, and racial anxieties that cast Asian men as threats to white masculinity, systematically stripping them of romantic and sexual agency. While some contemporary portrayals offer more nuance, representations of Asian men as emotionally complex and romantically desirable remain relatively rare. Asian women face a distinct but equally reductive set of stereotypes. They have been shaped by tropes such as the lotus blossom, submissive, demure, and the dragon lady, seductive, dangerous. Stereotypes rooted in Orientalist fantasies and shaped by histories of imperialism and military occupation. These perceptions were reinforced by legislations such as the Page Act of 1875, which prohibited Chinese women from immigrating to the US, laying the ground for fetishization of Asian women as hypersexual or stigmatized as immoral. In 20th century Western media, these portrayals became especially prominent, often casting Asian women as either exoticized objects of desire or threatening femme fatales. While these tropes appear less frequent in their original exaggerated forms, they persist in subtler ways or are replaced by new stereotypes, such as the tiger mum or the emotionally repressed overachiever. Although nuanced and multi-dimensional portrayals of Asian women are becoming more visible, they remain outnumbered by the reductive depictions that emphasize exotism, otherness, or unrealistic perfection. A major reason why these stereotypes persist is the continued lack of Asian creators behind the camera. When stories are written, directed, and produced without the input of people with lived experience, Asian characters, regardless of gender, are often reduced to background roles, stereotypes, or symbolic placeholders. While recent films and shows have challenged these patterns, authentic and varied representations remain the exception rather than the norm. Even in expansive modern franchises like Star Wars, these representational issues persist. Chirrut Wei, played by Donnie Yen, while a fan favourite, fits the mystic monk archetype, spiritual, skilled, yet is ultimately passive in the larger narrative. Though central to key moments, he does not drive the plot or assume leadership such as Jyn Erso or Cassian Andor. On the other hand, Rose Tico, introduced as a prominent character in The Last Jedi, was significantly sidelined in The Rise of Skywalker following racist backlash. While some defend this shift as a creative decision, her diminished role also highlights how women of colour face sidelining and erasure when met with fan resistance. These examples reveal a deeper problem. Because meaningful representations of Asian characters are limited, outdated tropes, no matter how old, continue to shape how Asian identities are portrayed. Without more consistent, diverse, and authentic storytelling, contemporary media struggles to break free from the reductive patterns established in early cinema. As a result, both Asian men and women are often confined to narrow narratives that fail to capture the full complexity of their humanity and lived experiences. Andor stands out as one of the most diverse and politically focused series within the Star Wars franchise, exploring themes of colonialism, radicalization, and systemic oppression. However, despite the notable diversity, Asian characters remain limited, with East Asian leads notably absent. Sunta Kaz, played by Varada Sethu, is one of the few Asian characters in the series. Her role as an active rebel operative marks a significant contribution, particularly during one of the series' most pivotal moments. While Sunta's inclusion in the rebellion represents progress for Asian representation within Star Wars, her character is not afforded the same level of emotional depth or narrative agency as other central characters like Mon Mothma or Luthen Rael. Despite being integral to the plot, Sunta is predominantly defined by her loyalty to the rebellion and her romantic subplot with Vel Sartha. This framing restricts her capability to function as a fully realised political agent in the manner other key characters do. For East Asians, the implication is subtle but powerful. They are rarely portrayed as leaders, rebels, or key agents of change. While Asian characters do appear in the Star Wars universe, their roles are often limited in scope. East Asians in particular are typically cast in supporting positions, background figures, spiritual guides, or sidekicks, rather than as central drivers of political or moral transformation. The issue in Andor is not simply the lack of Asian leads, though increased visibility would certainly be meaningful, but how that absence reflects the broader patterns across the franchise. In stories built about rebellion and resistance, Asian characters remain largely on the margins of the narrative's political and ethical core. These are spaces where agency is defined and power is challenged, and the continued underrepresentation of East Asians subtly reinforce which identities are most often imagined at the centre of revolutionary change.
People who saw Cassian Andor in Rogue One and felt like, my God, I've never seen myself as a Star Wars. That's all very important, and you can't understate that. I think as you and I being white males, we've had the luxury our entire lives of seeing ourselves on the screen, and to the point where we don't even think about it. So, there are probably a bunch of people who go, I don't get this all representation thing. Be like, yeah, you have the luxury of not getting it.
You're not supposed to really get it.
The Acolyte marks a tentative turning point. For the first time, East Asian characters occupy central roles. Lee Jong-jae's Master Soul navigates ethical ambiguity, while Manny Jacinto's Chimera challenges the traditional stereotype of the desexualized Asian male. Although the series lacks Asian female leads, Star Wars has made some progress in representing Asian women. The franchise offers rare but notable portrayals of East and Southeast Asian characters, though these remain uncommon. However, some may argue that these characters often lack full development and narrative depth, highlighting ongoing challenges in achieving the meaningful representation. The backlash to the Acolyte began before it even aired, an indication that, as Stuart Hall suggests, identity is always contested. When dominant cultural norms are challenged, discomfort often emerges not through explicit rejection, but through debates over story quality, tone, or authenticity. Some may argue that these critiques frequently mask deeper anxieties about cultural ownership and who is allowed to belong in the beloved mythologies. In the case of the Acolyte, this discomfort had tangible consequences. Early backlash and review bombing appear to have discouraged viewership, contributing to the show's underperformance and the decision not to proceed with a second season. With that, a rare opportunity to further develop emotionally and politically complex Asian male and black female leads was missed, highlighting how fragile process and representation remains. What could have been a meaningful step forward in genre storytelling was instead cut short, demonstrating that lasting change in mainstream media requires not only creative risks, but sustained structural support, such as merchandising and marketing. Star Wars has always been about hope, power, resistance, and identity, but who gets to resist? Who gets to be complex, angry, joyful, broken, or hopeful? As Hall suggests, identity is a process shaped by history and representation, and as Saeed made clear, representation is never neutral. It serves power and shapes possibility. If Asians are not seen leading revolutions in fiction, it becomes harder to imagine them doing so in reality or being recognised when they do. To truly embrace inclusion, major industries must go beyond aesthetic borrowing and token diversity. They should centre Asian characters not as stereotypical or ornamental, but as fully political or emotional agents. That means supporting Asian writers, directors and performers, challenging Orientalist tropes, and crafting stories that reflect the plurality of Asian identities, not just their visual appeal. Franchises like Star Wars shape more than stories. They can shape how we see ourselves and each other. Genuine progress in representation means moving beyond surface level diversity to embrace characters with depth, complexity and agency. Transformation requires deliberate, committed efforts from studios, creators and audiences alike. Only by challenging old stereotypes and centering authentic voices can media reflect the diverse realities of Asian identities and inspire new possibilities that have been long overlooked. The future of storytelling depends on this commitment, not just to inclusion as a checkbox, but the representation as an ongoing cultural practice that requires structural support and critical patience. A willingness to give marginalised narratives the space not only to be produced, but to take risks, evolve, and possibilities to thrive.